For more than 7 decades, Barbara and George H.W. Bush appeared to represent the American dream. They married when they were barely out of their teenage years, built a large family, survived decades of political pressure, and eventually reached the White House. To millions of Americans, they looked like the picture of a lasting marriage. But behind those photographs was a life shaped by war, separation, personal tragedy, family responsibilities, and enormous political ambition. Their story was not simply about a husband and wife who stayed together for 73 years. It was about two people who grew up together while the world around them constantly changed. Before Barbara became a first lady, before George became president, and before the Bush family became one of America's most powerful political families, they were simply two teenagers who met at a Christmas dance. And that meeting would change both of their lives forever. Barbara Pierce was born on June 8, 1925, in New York City. She grew up in a comfortable and well-connected American family. Her father, Marvin Pierce, worked in publishing and later became president of McCall Corporation, a major magazine company. Barbara was raised with the expectations and social traditions of a privileged American household. She developed a strong personality early in life and became known for being confident, outspoken, and direct. But despite her comfortable upbringing, Barbara's future was far from predictable. She could not have known that one day she would live inside the White House, become one of America's most recognizable political wives, and raise a family that would produce another president. In the early 1940s, she was simply a young woman growing up during a period when America was about to be transformed by World War II. In December 1941, Barbara attended a Christmas dance at a country club in Rye, New York. There, she met a 17-year-old young man named George Herbert Walker Bush. George was the son of Prescott Bush, a businessman who would later become a United States Senator. George was athletic, ambitious, and already thinking about his future. Barbara was only 16, but the two quickly developed a connection. What began as a teenage romance soon became much more serious. They wrote letters to one another and continued their relationship as America entered one of the most dangerous periods in its history. Just weeks before they met, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had pulled the United States directly into World War II. For Barbara and George, their young romance was about to unfold against the backdrop of a global conflict that would separate millions of young Americans from the people they loved. George Bush eventually joined the United States Navy and became a naval aviator. He was still remarkably young when he went to war. Barbara remained at home, waiting for letters and news from the man she loved. Their relationship now depended heavily on correspondence because George was thousands of miles away. The danger was real. During the war, George flew combat missions in the Pacific and faced situations in which his life was at risk. In September 1944, his aircraft was shot down during a mission over the Pacific. George survived and was rescued by an American submarine. But for Barbara and his family, the event would have been terrifying. The young couple had already learned that love could mean waiting, worrying, and trusting that the person on the other side of the world would eventually come home. When George returned from military service, the relationship that had begun as a teenage romance was ready to become something permanent. On January 6, 1945, Barbara Pierce married George Bush. Barbara was only 19 years old, while George was 20. Their wedding came during wartime, at a moment when many young couples were making life-changing decisions under extraordinary circumstances. They did not yet know what their future would look like. George had ambitions, but he was still a young veteran trying to determine what direction his life would take. Barbara was entering adulthood as a wife, and soon she would become a mother. Their marriage would begin far away from the political spotlight that would later surround them. They were not yet the Bush family known across America. They were simply a young couple beginning a life together, carrying the memories of a wartime romance and trying to build a future in a rapidly changing country. After the war, George and Barbara moved to Texas, where George entered the oil business. He worked hard to establish himself and eventually became successful in the growing Texas oil industry. Barbara became the center of their expanding family. Their first child, George Walker Bush, was born in 1946. More children followed, and over the years, the family eventually grew to 6 children. Barbara's life became deeply connected to raising and supporting the family, while George pursued increasingly ambitious goals. The couple were still young, but their responsibilities were growing quickly. They were no longer simply 2 teenagers who had fallen in love. They were parents trying to create a stable home, while George looked toward opportunities that would eventually take him far beyond the oil fields of Texas. But the young family would soon face a tragedy that would remain with Barbara and George for the rest of their lives. In 1949, their daughter Pauline Robinson Bush, known as Robin, was diagnosed with leukemia. She was only 3 years old. At a time when childhood leukemia was extremely difficult to treat, the family watched helplessly as Robin became seriously ill. Barbara and George desperately hoped their daughter could recover, but the disease took her life in October 1953. Robin was only 3 years old. The loss was devastating. For Barbara, the death of her little girl became one of the deepest emotional wounds of her life. Years later, she would speak about Robin with a mixture of love and sorrow. The tragedy changed the family forever and became a private part of Barbara's life that existed beneath the confident public image people would eventually see. Life after loss. After Robin's death, Barbara and George had to continue raising their other children while carrying the pain of losing a daughter. Life did not stop for the Bush family. George continued building his career, and Barbara continued caring for their children. But the experience of losing Robin had changed them. Barbara had to find a way to move forward while still carrying grief that could never completely disappear. At the same time, George's professional ambitions were becoming stronger. He was determined to build a successful career, and Barbara supported him as their family moved through different stages of life. The public would eventually see Barbara as a strong and confident woman, but that strength had been shaped by experiences that most people outside the family could never fully understand. George Bush's career gradually moved beyond business and into public service. His growing responsibilities took the family into new environments and introduced them to the world of American politics and diplomacy. Barbara adapted to each new chapter. She was no longer simply the young wife who had waited for a naval pilot to return from war. She was now the wife of an increasingly influential American public figure and the mother of a growing family. George would eventually serve in important positions, including chairman of the Republican National Committee, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president, and ultimately president. Each new position brought greater pressure and greater public attention. Barbara remained beside him through these changes, but the higher George climbed, the more demanding their life became. Looking back at the beginning of Barbara and George Bush's marriage, it is easy to see only the happy photographs and the remarkable 73-year timeline. But their story was already filled with experiences that tested them long before they reached the White House. They had met as teenagers, survived wartime separation, married at 19, built a large family, and suffered the devastating loss of their young daughter. George's ambitions were also taking him toward a world of politics, intelligence, diplomacy, and eventually presidential power. Barbara would have to adapt to every new chapter, while carrying responsibilities that were often hidden from the public. The young couple who once met at a Christmas dance were slowly becoming one of America's most recognizable political families. But the greatest challenges of their marriage were still ahead. In the next chapter, Barbara would face emotional struggles, enormous political pressure, and the difficult reality of living beside a man whose career was moving toward the highest levels of American power. The death of Robin changed the Bush family in a way that could never truly be undone. Barbara and George continued raising their children, but they were no longer the same young couple who had entered marriage with simple hopes for the future. Barbara had experienced a loss that would remain part of her life for decades. Yet there was no choice but to keep moving forward. George continued working toward his professional goals, while Barbara focused on their growing family. From the outside, their lives appeared to be moving normally again. But grief does not always disappear simply because life continues. Sometimes it becomes something a person learns to carry. For Barbara, that experience would shape the way she viewed family, motherhood, and the importance of being there for her children. While Barbara concentrated on family life, George's career was beginning to expand. His success in the Texas oil business gave him financial independence, but he wanted something more. He had always been ambitious, and gradually his attention turned toward public service and politics. In 1964, George entered national politics by running for the United States Senate from Texas. He lost that election, but the defeat did not end his political ambitions. Instead, it became another step in a much longer journey. Barbara stood beside him as he continued trying. For the family, this meant that politics was becoming part of everyday life. Campaigns, travel, meetings, public appearances, and new relationships increasingly occupied George's time. Barbara had to adapt to a world very different from the one she had known as a teenager. The Bush family continued to grow, and Barbara became the central figure in maintaining a sense of family stability. George and Barbara eventually had 6 children, and their household became busy and demanding. Their children would grow up in an environment where public service and ambition were increasingly important parts of their father's life. Barbara worked to give them a normal family environment, despite the unusual path their lives were taking. She was known for being direct with her children and for encouraging independence. But raising a large family while supporting a husband with growing political ambitions was not easy. George's career required travel and long hours, while Barbara often carried much of the responsibility for the children and the home. The balance between political ambition and family life would become one of the recurring challenges of their marriage. George's political career eventually began taking him beyond Texas. In 1971, President Richard Nixon appointed him United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Suddenly, the Bush family was living in a world of international diplomacy and Washington politics. Barbara adapted to the demands of diplomatic life and became part of the social and political environment surrounding her husband's position. But the move also demonstrated how dramatically their lives had changed. Just a few decades earlier, Barbara had been a teenage girl waiting for letters from a young naval pilot serving overseas. Now she was accompanying her husband through the highest levels of American public life. The transition was remarkable, but every new position also brought new expectations, responsibilities, and scrutiny. George's career continued to move quickly. After his role at the United Nations, he became chairman of the Republican National Committee, and later served as chief of the United States Liaison Office in Beijing. Then came one of the most demanding positions of his career, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. For Barbara and the children, these changes meant repeatedly adapting to new places and new circumstances. Their family moved many times during George's career. Barbara became skilled at creating a sense of home wherever they lived. She understood that political life could be unpredictable, and she often focused on keeping the family connected. But behind the scenes, the constant movement and pressure could also be exhausting. The Bush family was becoming increasingly prominent, while Barbara was quietly managing the human side of that rise. By the 1970s, Barbara was carrying more than the responsibilities of a political wife and mother. She had experienced the loss of her daughter, years of constant change, and the pressures that came with her husband's career. During this period, Barbara struggled with depression. She later spoke openly about how difficult those years could be for her. Her public image was often that of a confident, energetic woman who could handle almost anything. But privately, she could feel overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted. Her experience is important because it shows another side of the woman the public thought it knew. Barbara's strength did not mean she never struggled. In fact, some of her strength came from learning how to confront those struggles and continue moving forward. As George's political profile grew, Barbara became increasingly important to his public life. She accompanied him to events, met political leaders, supported campaigns, and became familiar with the demanding world of Washington. But Barbara was not simply a silent political wife. She developed her own opinions and was known for expressing them clearly. Her humor and blunt personality sometimes made headlines, but they also made her relatable to many Americans. She understood George's personality better than almost anyone else. Their relationship had survived from adolescence into adulthood, and they had experienced some of life's greatest highs and lowest moments together. Yet political success can place unusual pressure on a marriage, particularly when private disagreements or rumors become part of public discussion. By the late 1970s, George Bush had become a major figure within the Republican Party. He was appointed director of the CIA and later became vice president under Ronald Reagan. The Bush family was now living at the center of American political power. Barbara's role became increasingly visible, but the expectations also became greater. Every public appearance mattered. Every statement could attract attention. The family was constantly surrounded by political supporters, journalists, advisors, and officials. For Barbara, maintaining a sense of normality became more difficult. She continued to focus heavily on family, but the private world she had known was becoming smaller. Their marriage was no longer simply a personal relationship between two people. It had become part of a much larger public story. The path toward the White House was beginning to come into view, but reaching it would require enormous sacrifice. George had spent decades building his career, while Barbara had spent decades adapting to the consequences of that career. She had raised children, endured tragedy, moved from place to place, and supported her husband through political defeats and successes. Their lives had become inseparable from the American political system. Yet Barbara's own identity remained complicated. She was proud of George, but she also understood the costs of political life. The family had already experienced loss and emotional hardship, and now they were approaching the most intense period of public attention they had ever faced. George was preparing for a presidential campaign, and Barbara was about to become a national figure in her own right. By the end of the 1970s, Barbara and George Bush had already been married for more than 3 decades. They had experienced war, young love, parenthood, tragedy, career changes, and years of political pressure. Their marriage had survived circumstances that could have divided many couples, but the future would bring an entirely different level of attention. George would eventually become vice president and then run for president of the United States. Barbara would step onto the national stage as one of the most recognizable political wives in America. The public would see her confidence, humor, and famous pearls. But behind that image was a woman who had experienced grief and depression and had spent much of her life holding a complicated family together. The next chapter would take their marriage into the White House, where the private life of Barbara Bush would become impossible to separate from the public life of the American presidency.